We now turn to look at the general moral theory of St. Thomas Aquinas. His ethics is a teleological ethics like Aristotle's, which is not surprising, given the influence of Aristotle upon St. Thomas Aquinas. In many ways, Aquinas' moral theory is a Christian modification of Aristotle's ethics, and like Aristotle, he believes in teleology, as I mentioned, and he takes this view to manifest in the idea that each event occurs because of an end towards which it is directed. Human beings have ends and inclinations, both natural and both the ones we select ourselves, and, according to Aquinas, are the only earthly beings that can consciously choose to act towards these ends and inclinations. And for Aquinas, ethics deals with determining which ends are worthy of our pursuit and which are not. And much like Aristotle, he believes that the moral good is a fulfillment of the natural end of humans. Now, since Aquinas brings God into ethics, he has to put an account of evil. Now, Aristotle has an account of evil and perfection as well, but it's a bit easier for Aristotle, being that he doesn't have God in his theory. Now, the standard reply used by Aquinas is one used by other thinkers of this time period, namely the idea that evil is a lack or privation. So evil is not a positive thing. To use an analogy, it's somewhat like short. Shortness is not a positive quality. It's not that people have a whole bunch of short when they're not tall. It's that they lack in tallness. And likewise, evil is not seen as a positive thing. It's not that people have evil. They simply have a lack of good. And this ties into the problem of evil, which is an interesting problem in theology and metaphysics, but goes beyond the scope of our current discussion. Now, Aquinas considers all genuine actions to be good or bad. No genuine actions are morally neutral. Now, this might seem sort of odd until we distinguish between the various types of actions. Now, the reason why he takes this view is because he regards all chosen actions as always seeking an end, and this end will ultimately be either a good end or a bad end. Now, going back to our categorizations of intellectualism and voluntarism, Aquinas is an intellectualist in the sense that he believes the intellect is primary in ethics, and only chosen deliberate actions actually have moral qualities. So for him, the will desires what is good, so we are good seekers by nature. But reason is needed to determine what is good and the means for achieving it. So to use a crappy analogy, the will is like a rocket power that drives us, and what we're driven for is the good. But of course, if we're just driven by our will to seek the good, the intellect has to tell us what is actually good and how to require it. So his assumption is we seek the good by our nature. Our will just does that. But the will has to be properly guided. Now, getting back to his claim that all genuine actions are good or bad, there are no morally neutral actions, he distinguishes between what he calls human actions and acts of humans. Human actions are voluntary, consciously willed actions, and they're chosen because the individual's reason is seeking a specific end. Human actions are either good or bad. Now, in contrast, an act of humans, or an act of a particular human, these acts are unconscious or involuntary behaviors. For example, just breathing naturally, or sneezing, or some other, having your heart just keep beating. And those actions, for Aquinas, are morally neutral, because they're not willed, they're not chosen by reason, and they do not act towards any particular chosen end. Now, much like Aristotle, when assessing an action morally, he considers the following factors. First, the object of the action. Secondly, the circumstances of the action. Thirdly, the end of the action. His example that he uses to illustrate this is the giving of alms, basically giving to charity. Now, the object, of course, is to give money to a person who is in need. The circumstances particular to that action would include such things as where the money came from. How did one acquire it? Was it earned through work, through theft, through stocks, bonds? Was it just simply found? And other factors such as the needs of the recipient, and so on. Now, also of importance is the end, which is the goal of the action, which could be to help someone who's in need, or for the person to be praised for their generosity, or perhaps to get a tax break for giving to charity. Now, although Aquinas was strongly influenced by Aristotle, obviously Aristotle was a pagan, and Aquinas, since he's a saint, was clearly not. He was, a Christian, a devout Christian. Now, what he ends up doing is modifying Aristotle's theory. And I often use the crappy analogy of a layer cake. What you have in Aquinas' view is basically the first layer is Aristotle's moral theory. And then put on top of that is another layer, the Christian modification added by Aquinas. So sort of the foundation of Aquinas' moral theory is essentially Aristotle. And then he adds in the extra material that comes from Christianity. Now, Aristotle's theory does put humans in a special role, because we're rational and other stuff is not. But of course, God plays no role in Aristotle's theory because he did not believe in the monotheistic God, so it does not have any role in his theory. Now, Aquinas held that Aristotle provided a natural ethical theory built on achieving happiness, albeit imperfect and temporal happiness, here on earth. But, again, since Aquinas is a Christian, he claims that we long for something beyond just happiness here on earth. And he claims that we long for the perfect good, which of course cannot be found here in the imperfect realm of the world. So we long for something beyond this world. Now, Aquinas, since he believes in a purposeful universe, he believes that nature does not provide us with a means of satisfying one's spiritual nature. But, since it's a purposeful universe, there has to be some way of achieving satisfaction of the spiritual nature. Where can the supreme good be found? Well, not surprisingly for Aquinas, only in God. Now, unfortunately, the supreme good is not acquired by simply having intellectual or philosophical knowledge of God. You've got to actually have acquaintance with God. And even more, unfortunately, one cannot have acquaintance with God unless one is dead, because acquaintance with God, according to Aquinas, is not possible in this life. So, he infers that our desire for ultimate happiness shows there must be an afterlife. Again, because he works from the assumption that whatever occurs has to occur for an end or purpose. Hence, if we have a desire for this ultimate happiness, this indicates there must be an afterlife.